Awesome. Seems like your recording has started. Yeah, so we'll
Yeah,
kick things off.
go
So
ahead.
today we wanted to discuss third-party script loading. This is a really complex space with many dimensions to it, but is one that has impacted web performance for over a decade. And so today, Pat and I would like to discuss a few ideas for incrementally improving this from both the web platform and browser side. Before we go into ideas, it's probably useful to just level set, about what we're talking about here. So, what's the problem with loading performance? There's about three top-level problems. Every resource has to be optimized for performance. So everything from scripts, fonts, CSS, images. A lot of folks on this call have dealt with these problems before. Second problem is we have quite a few difficult scheduling and ordering problems that span the network and the client. Uh, these types of problems can speak to the right ordering for resources that are first party versus third party resources that might be getting injected into the page by your CMS or the platform that you're on, effective pipelining. And then the third problem is that third-party scripts just generally add randomness to an already precarious loading sequence. I also wanted to thank Shruti Paniker for her help with this slide. So what do we mean by third-party scripts? This is a very big bucket of stuff. So it's everything from analytics scripts, CDN scripts, customer success, help desk, widgets, video players, folks may be embedding into their pages, marketing, tag managers. There's a lot that goes into the Wild West that are third-party scripts, but we're typically talking about this large category of things that are not necessarily owned by the first party that are including them into their site. Now, I wanted to call out, we have been doing quite a bit of research on the Chrome side into third parties for the last couple of quarters. And most studies that we've done, whether they are via developer surveys or via quantitative analysis, lab-based analysis and so on, is shown that optimizing third parties remain one of the top challenges for sites that want to do well on performance and want to do well on metrics like the Core Web Vitals. We've historically seen that every year, a large percentage of JavaScript execution on the whole across the web does tend to be third-party code. And there's a lot of just general nuance to this problem space. So it's a multi-headed problem. And these are only some of the issues with it. The first is goals. There are sites who may care a lot about user experience, and they may also care about business outcomes. People struggle to understand how to balance those two. If we're making, if people are making a lot of revenue by having certain third parties on their sites, they may have a harder time justifying, putting time into the user experience benefits of maybe deferring those third parties. But ultimately, the goals don't always align. The next one is metrics. Do sites have sufficient insight into costly third parties? We've been having lots of great discussions with Yoav over the last year about whether we should be increasing, signals in resource timing about bite-sized visibility, improving long task attribution, or improving visibility into iframe activity. There are organizational issues here. Very often, the audiences that are introducing costly third parties may not be performance experts. They may not even be engineers. It's very often folks who are in marketing or business stakeholders who are using a tag manager to inject third parties into the pages. Very often working around the engineering teams. And so it can end up being a little bit of a blind spot. Then we've got ecosystem. Are third parties incentivized to care about their footprint? Some very much are, some are not. Another issue here is that latency can abhor a vacuum. So well-behaved third parties may end up freeing up the main thread. Does that encourage others to fill the void? And there's more that we could possibly be doing on the web platform side, giving developers sufficient knobs to get more control over this problem, and via developer tooling. So making sure that site owners have got enough attribution in the lab and enough actionability to improve things. So we're going to talk about two dimensions to this problem space today. Pat is going to kick us off talking about resource ordering and a little bit more about what we could be doing on the platform side. And then I'm going to be talking a little bit about a few ideas for what we could be doing on the browser side to improve the defaults for folks who are using third parties. Pat, do you want to take over?
Sure. Can you flip the next slide? And next slide. So
I mean, as Addy's mentioned, getting the order right can have a huge impact on performance. I mean, I remember studies going back close to 2010, 2011 or so, when we were working on page speed service, where PhD grads were doing understudies about like cutting the load times in half if you could predict the perfect order to deliver the resources in. And so a lot of Chrome work has been going around. How can we do that automatically? And more recently, a lot of work in the WebPerf working group has been, what can we do to give devs the knobs they need to try and get closer to that optimal ordering on the delivery side of things, at least. The most basic lever we've always had is sort of reordering things in the HTML, moving your blocking scripts to the end of the body. It's kind of one of Steve's original rules, right? Async and defer for scripts has been added. To some levels of success, unblocking the parser, but less control over the loading and execution of when those things happen. Lazy loading for images and iframes in particular, if you happen to be doing a straight up embed iframe. But if you're doing it through scripts, you have a lot less control over it. And then some of the sort of hinting to the browser for the things that it can't discover with DNS prefetch, preconnect, preload. Hopefully now it can actually be used. And then if you want to go on to the next slide, some of the things that are more in flight right now, at least on the Chrome side, we're experimenting with priority hints to hopefully give you some more knobs to indicate which scripts are more important for your user experience, to hopefully tweak that order around a little bit. Which images are more important? Should some images be more important than blocking scripts or not? And sort of that thing that's hard to get automatically right all of the time. Our hope is we can give developers explicit controls that we don't rely on sort of automated heuristics. At a protocol level, HTTP2 was sort of the first one where we had priority support of some kind. It wasn't greatly supported or implemented. Hopefully that's changing with HTTP3, although the priority support is an extension. It's not part of the core protocol. And protocol level prioritization doesn't work across origins, so it doesn't really help a whole lot with third parties. And that's kind of one of the things that we had to back away from after launching HTTP2 originally was, when you have 10 different origins all serving content in parallel and each one can only prioritize within itself, you still need some level of orchestration across all of those origins. And so we're kind of almost back to HTTP 1.1 world of trying to do pull scheduling on the client side. Early hints is in experiments right now as well, just sort of another way to do preload, preconnect, all of that kind of stuff earlier in the process. Is there anything on the loading side of things that we don't know yet, that you won't like? Is there something missing from being able to explicitly define an order if you happened to know the proper order ahead of time? And sometimes, like, the first party site won't know what the third party resources are going to load. Like even Google Fonts, for example, you know what CSS you're going to load. You may not know the actual font file that's going to be loading. And so you can't hint at that. You can pre-connect and maybe try and warm things up. If we go to the next slide. And this is just on the loading side. I mean, we've noticed with async in particular, control over execution of the scripts has been sort of problematic. Async running the script whenever it happens to load ends up running and blocking the main thread. When you happen to try doing critical user interactions, for example, one of the things we've sort of been playing with a little bit, does preloading the script and then in the onload handler determining if it's a good time to insert the actual script tag dynamically may give you some level of control. Do we need something declarative to say, don't run this async script until after X event? And what are those X events? And are they something the browser can actually know about? Next slide. And then rendering, it's sort of one of those black boxes right now. Everything in the head that's blocking is definitely render blocking. A/B scripts, anti-flicker snippers, kind of the bane of our existence, particularly with LCP, especially if you've got an A/B test that's not actually doing anything, but you block rendering. Is there something we need to do declarative or to provide more controls over when the browser should be rendering the first content? Safari and Chrome have very different views about incrementally displaying content as it arrives versus trying to provide as much parsing and content at the first render event, for example. Do devs need more control over that? I think that's it on the sort of where we are on dev knobs and problem set spaces, and it's kind of across a lot of things. We're hoping giving devs, if we can find that we have all of the atomic controls for devs to be able to do exactly the ordering that they would want to get the optimal experience. We don't necessarily know that adoption will be huge, but do we have, or will we have all of the knobs that are necessary to make those changes? Which sort of kicks into Addie's next step, which is, okay, what can we do when we have those knobs?
Thanks, Pat. So we talked about, for folks who are potentially incentivized to reduce the impact that third-party scripts can have on their overall performance and have the experience, how can we give them sufficient knobs? For folks that are incentivized but may not have sufficient experience, what are other things that we could potentially be doing to help here from the browser side of things? Ideally, to intervene on behalf of users to help the situation. Now, if we're talking about intervening or changing the defaults in some way, we often end up talking about interventions. So what is an intervention? An intervention is often a user agent intervention where the browser opts for an intentional deviation from behavior that developers might expect or rely on. And it's often motivated by the desire to fulfill an important user need. Interventions are historically something that browsers have invested in, but they're also not risk-free, and very often carefulness is a key part of thinking about whether or not intervention should be applied. And so I want to stress that for this section, we're really talking about, especially for sites who are interested in reducing the impact that third parties can have on their performance, how can we help them out a little bit more? Now, interventions have successfully improved user experience in many cases over the years. We've seen interventions being used across, passive touch event listeners, throttling timers that are out of view in different iframes, throttling the rendering pipeline if frames or particular parts of the page are not necessarily visible, or throttling expensive timers that are in frames. We've seen quite a few of these play out over the last number of years to varying degrees of success, but especially where we're able to identify a very specific pain and the situations where it's just really difficult to get this right. I think that there is a case to be made that maybe the platform could be helping people improve their performance and user experience at scale if we can get this right. So I wanted to cover two examples of things we could potentially do. Pat talked about knobs earlier and mentioned loading equals lazy. A lot of our focus around loading equals lazy has been images and additionally iframes. And for folks who are incentivized to use them, they're seeing some success. What if the browser was to help out here a little bit more by default? So to give you some background, very often embeds today on the web are highly interactive, very often pulling in hundreds of kilobytes of script, keeping the main thread pegged, and delaying things like interactivity potentially for other parts of the page due to resource contention. There is a case to be made that maybe embeds that are off screen, think of video players that are much lower down in a blog post or on a recipe site. Do those really need to be eagerly loaded? Maybe not. We've done a few initial experiments to understand, what is the potential performance improvement we could see here. A lot of this done in the lab rather than field. But we've seen some significant improvements in some cases to total blocking time, as well as significant improvements to data savings when we're only loading embeds when a user scrolls closer to them. So that's one potential intervention a browser could explore. Lazy loading iframes, lazy loading embeds that are off screen. Another potential idea we have is being able to identify third parties that are slightly less critical in the page. So as a reminder, earlier we mentioned that third parties are responsible for 57% of script execution on the web. They can impact interactivity, but we also know that this is very nuanced. Sometimes you might have scripts for social media sharing, live help, or even A/B testing or personalization. And sometimes these scripts are actually really important for the critical rendering path and what gets rendered for users early on. Sometimes they're not. And so you can't arbitrarily throttle everything that isn't first party. What you can potentially do is targeted throttling. So defining a set of heuristics and signals that indicate if a script may be safe to throttle. So there are a few potential ideas. I'll take questions very soon, but there are a few potential ideas here for how one could go about identifying what is less critical. Is the third-party script included at the bottom of the document versus the head? Has it initiated long tasks that exceed a certain budget? Is it loaded but never used? Is it fetched after LCP? Does it have a long request chain with gaps between different requests that are being made? There are a lot of potential signals that somebody could use. This is, of course, a place where additional developer annotation could also help. And that speaks a little bit, going back to what Pat was saying about priority hints and additional signals. I'll pause there before moving on. I think, Aram, you maybe had a question first in the queue.
Yeah, I think just from a recording perspective, it's better to take questions at the end.
Okay. All right, we'll be wrapping up slides then very soon. So in terms of what are the opportunities here? One thing we've been doing is working with a few partners just to understand, if you were taking a look at optimizing your third-party script loading, could you see significant improvements to key performance metrics, whether it's in the field, whether it's in the lab, and to what extent, if any, could you see business outcome improvements off the back of that? And so these are anonymized partners. We can share around case studies with folks interested in learning more. But for these partners, we've seen improvements in LCP, improvements in Core Web Vitals pass rates, and better TTI, in addition to business outcome improvements across the board. That's not to say that this is a simple problem space and that interventions are, an easy way to get these kinds of wins. But I do think it shows that there is potentially appetite in the ecosystem and also some room to be able to do this without impacting business outcomes in a negative way. So how do we optimize for no surprise and make sure that if we were exploring these ideas around interventions, we weren't surprising developers? Well, with a lot of these ideas, the goal would be to do as much of this development in public on extended timelines. So researching, prototyping, and outline with developers in public. Like, how are we thinking about, deciding on heuristics? How are we thinking about lazy loading embeds? All of these ideas would need to be validated in production in a way that could get us back like real field data from production sites to make sure that people are actually seeing good improvements. And potentially, if we were able to build enough confidence in these ideas, maybe there's an argument to be made about shipping a new default and iterating on it. But on the whole, I think that there is something to be said about considering the role that interventions could play in helping those who are interested in improving their performance, where third parties are maybe hurting them a little bit, but may not have as much experience to actually be able to take control of that situation. So that's it for the slides. I'd love to pause there and take questions. We've got Aram and Dan.
Okay, yeah, let me just stop the recording and we can move on to discussion.